I'm Allison, and this is my dog. And last time you saw how we managed to move my mountain of foliage into my new home, and my newest adventure. But now it seems like a good time to officially close the tiny living chapter of my life. Well, at least the permanent tiny living part. I still have big plans for the even tinier trailer. So, what was it like living in a tiny house for 2 years? Well, first of all, I'll admit that I didn't do any kind of big purge or anything of my stuff before I moved. I didn't have a lot of stuff to begin with because I'd been living in teeny tiny apartments all over Seattle for a decade. So I'd already whittled down my life to mostly essentials anyway. Which brings me to lesson number 1. You will get rid of a lot of stuff, but it will be a process. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. When I made this move, I got a storage unit and slowly got rid of more of my stuff. In the end, I was down to some furniture I'd held on to and some things I only use sometimes, but were really bulky, like my snowshoes and my paddleboard. I wasn't about to give up my paddleboard. When I moved in, I clearly marked boxes of essentials to bring into my home with a star. Everything without a star on it went to storage, where I left it and didn't look at it for a month. Out of sight, out of mind. After every month, I'd have a small list of stuff I either needed or that I missed, so I'd go get it. It kept the move from being too overwhelming, and I got to try out my space before I made any drastic decisions in my decluttering. And when I tried out my space with just the barest of bare essentials, I learned lesson number 2. Cooking and feeding myself doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, nothing has to be complicated at all. Not my work, not fitness, not getting dressed for the day. Life doesn't have to be that complicated, and it doesn't actually require all that much stuff. A one-pan meal can be almost as enjoyable as my 3-course beef Wellington Thanksgiving feast. I can get a fine workout in if I strategize a little and don't do my squats too close to the cacti. I found I didn't need a whole lot of stuff to enjoy the everyday acts of living. Well, as much as one can enjoy weightlifting in a room full of tiny knives. Now, if this is starting to make you a little claustrophobic, I get it. I had my moments there too a few times.
My house is in pieces.
Disaster.
Just chaos.
We are fleeing the situation today.
It's been such a hard week.
But here's another really important thing I learned and appreciated more deeply living in the tiny house. It was, number 3, filling very specific needs for me at the time. I spent just a little more time on the road traveling in the tiny trailer than I actually did at quote-unquote home in my tiny house in the 2 years that I had it. So I very importantly had the luxury of being able to take a breather and get some space in the entire rest of the United States. Not to mention, when you spend all that time living in a teardrop trailer, your perspective on what it means to live small shifts a little, and my tiny house actually felt cavernous after 4 months on the road. And when I am home, I'm out hiking or backpacking every weekend anyway. So I didn't need a house full of stuff. I didn't need much at home when I was there, and there was no point in paying for more space that would sit empty most of the time. And I wanted to be saving money for some property to call my own someday anyway. So for me, it was a great fit. It filled a specific need, or rather, didn't meet a bunch of needs that I didn't have anymore. Maybe you have different needs, which is why whittling your life down to a tiny house is an extremely personal decision. And I'm glad I made that decision for myself because I learned this next lesson. You gotta sit.
Good, Sid. Are you ready? Should we go? Let's go.
Number 4, living in a small space gets me outside and in my community more. Not only does having neighbors on top of you at an RV or tiny home park force one to socialize a bit more, but I also just wanted to get out of the house a little more in general when I lived there. When I'm at home, I tend to be a homebody, but I still found myself getting into trail running on the local trails. I joined a gym to get a bit more space for my squats, and I hiked around town a lot during the week. Claustrophobia gets you out of the house in the best way, because sometimes, yes, you do get cabin fever. Speaking of cabin fever, nothing started to give it to me more in the tiny house, more than mess. In a tiny space where presumably you actually need and use every square inch of that space for daily life, you learn lesson number 5. If something goes wrong or gets even a little messy, it needs to be fixed now. There's no second bathroom upstairs to use if the first one floods. In fact, speaking from experience, if it floods even just a little, your entire house will become unlivable. A small mess from, say, repotting a bunch of plants can't just be left for later to clean up, especially if you're hungry right now because that plant potting counter is also your only kitchen counter and you need it to make dinner. This is also where it helps to have less stuff. Less stuff means less stuff to clean, or less stuff you have to move to clean something else.
Whoa. Get. Go on. Go on. Get. Get.
And now is probably a good time to mention, or rather give a disclaimer, that if you're looking into tiny house living for yourself, lesson number 6 I learned seems obvious, but hits hard anyway once you're up to your ears in dishes and dog hair. There are limits. And not just the hard physical limits of the actual square footage and layout of your space, but real psychological limits on how much life and living you can feasibly cram into a small space. Example. Yes, I made an entire beef Wellington feast in here that one time and had a blast doing so. But it was just Isis and I in here. If you add even one guest, things start to get a little nutty. At one point, I was regularly having someone over, and their massive dog too. And when they would go home afterward, I would immediately have to clean and then take a long nap. When you add more people and animals to the situation, and Lord have mercy, children, you're going to find your own personal tolerance for noise and lack of privacy real quick. You'll also improve your flexibility in stepping over creatures and stuff that are always in the space you need to be walking in. Maybe that sounds to you like a cozy way to settle down with your partner, or it might sound like your own personal nightmare. But those are decisions you're gonna have to make for yourself by knowing yourself. In fact, this brings me to lesson number 7. Tiny house living requires you to get to know yourself, like really get to know yourself. And due to the close quarters I mentioned earlier, you'll have to deeply get to know the people you will quite literally be living on top of. Just living in a tiny house isn't automatically going to solve all your problems you think it might. Just the same way moving to a city doesn't automatically make you a different person. In fact, condensing yourself and your life and maybe your family and everything that I assume makes you happiest into the smallest possible box tends to put in sharper focus any personal problems you might have been trying to run away from. And it requires you to really know yourself to make decisions about how you're going to use your space that will truly make you happy. I know that sounds kind of heavy, but the same is true for a lot of stuff you deal with in life. Buying something or changing something superficial about your life can be a transformative experience, but it won't do the hard work for you of getting at the root of what makes you happy, what makes you unhappy, and, really knowing yourself. I was the same Allison as I always was, with the same passions and skills and interests and bad habits and faults as before, no matter where I lived. So maybe I should call this lesson number 8 and say acquiring or disposing of material possessions won't make you a new person. Now maybe let's talk about something a little lighter. I mentioned it earlier, but it bears repeating and calling it out as its own lesson. Number 9, you will have no privacy. If you live with others in a tiny house or even have guests overnight, you will have absolutely no privacy whatsoever. The only thing standing between you trying to make your coffee in the morning and everyone in the house who may have caught the same stomach bug the night before is a hollow plywood sliding door. And almost no sleeping lofts in your standard tiny house layout have doors, so you'd only be half a wall away from the rest of your family or your guests every night when you go to sleep. Speaking of family and growing into your space and stuff like that, at some point in my tiny house adventure, it was time to make a decision. I wouldn't be working from home, and my second home on the road, forever, and I was missing my friends and my community again back in Seattle as things were opening up after the pandemic. So I came home from the road one last time after a long trip to Alaska. More on that later. And I started looking for property to move my tiny house to. In doing this, I learned this bonus lesson. It's not actually easy to find a place to move a tiny house. I had some minimum requirements for the property I wanted, with a minimum distance to my actual office I'd be returning to eventually, and I discovered that most places don't actually want you living in a tiny house. And they have all kinds of labyrinthine rules about minimum square footage and roof heights and so on and so forth. I spoke with an attorney and came to the conclusion I would have to modify my tiny house hobby farm dreams just a little. I decided I'd be better off buying a quote-unquote normal house on land that met my requirements. So, all that to say, the last lesson to be had here was that number 10, tiny house living might not be right for you forever. Over the years and over my travels, I've put together a dream for myself that I'd go start an off-grid hobby farm somewhere to sustain my appetite and interests well after I retire. But I wasn't overly attached to any specific vision of what that looked like. I was looking for the opportunity though, and it seemed like I'd find that opportunity if I left the tiny house behind. So I did. And now I'm really excited for what's to come. I've got a project list a mile long now and so many fun ideas for what I'm going to do with 5 whole acres. 1 year later, I still wander around the property with my mind a bit boggled. For example, I have a tree in my backyard that's so huge I could probably build a couple tiny houses with its lumber if it ever fell down. So stay tuned for the adventures of Allison's Acres, or something like that. It's already been a ride. Thanks for joining me these last couple years on this tiny house adventure.
You gotta sit.
Good, Sid. Are you ready?
Hear those frogs?